Hello and welcome to another episode of Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earth 911 podcast. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and it's another of our Innovator interviews. And we're very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Paul Zeitz, who is a veteran of sustainable thinking, global justice, the AIDS campaigns of the 80s and 90s, and where he was the leader of the Global AIDS Alliance, as well as working at the State Department for many years in the last decade as the director of the Data Revolution for Sustainable Development. So Dr. Zeitz has explored how to bring a more just and equitable world that can preserve the planet into reality for a very long time. Dr. Zeitz, or Paul, may I call you Paul?
Great. Hi, Mitch. Thanks for having me on the show.
So, Paul, tell us, how did you end up where you are today, launching Build a Movement 2020, which is at www.drpaulzeitz.org. It's a challenge to people to step up and begin to participate in this evolving political conversation. Why now? Why here?
Thank you, Mitch. I'm excited to be able to share with you that I have worked over the past decades on building social movements and political movements that have had a huge impact on the trajectory of history. And so Build a Movement 2020 builds on that experience and is applying approaches to solve the urgent challenges that we're facing today around the climate emergency. So I was working on global AIDS as a physician. I was in a programmatic role, and our response was completely failing. It was completely impotent. It was too small scale and small-minded. And I learned by connecting and working and networking and building a global movement from the local level to the global level, from the global north and the global south, and connecting the dots between these stakeholder networks, we could actually create political change and mobilize a massive international response to a crisis that had been being ignored. And so I feel like that experience brings me to this Build a Movement 2020 now as a way of moving forward now to address the climate emergency.
And I think over the course of the last several years, many people have just come face to face with the reality of the climate emergency that we face. Extreme weather, drought, what just happened with Dorian in the Bahamas, sitting over the island for 40 hours, wiping everything off the earth. These are all hard to ignore, and they took something that was very shapeless, very difficult to put your head around, climate change, and made it very real for a lot of folks. Do you see many people moving to this conversation now that had previously been sitting on the sidelines?
I think the experiences of the changing weather patterns, the worsening and the intensity of the storms that we're experiencing, the wildfires in California, the droughts, the collapsing of the coral reefs, the extinction of thousands of species, I think all these things together are waking people up. And I think particularly the younger generation, I'm frequently surprised at how educated they are and how aware they are about the negligence that our older generations, including myself, have failed to really address this emergency, and how they feel like their future is being robbed from them. And I do think the political landscape is dramatically changing now because of the youth-led climate movements that are growing rapidly.
Now, you've been participating in this for a long time. You've written a book called Waging Justice, which is a memoir about your participation in the AIDS battle. And I'm curious, how has what you've seen develop with climate mirrored or been different than what you saw with the acknowledgement and then actual attack on AIDS on a global basis?
So the interesting thing is that I really have dug in on climate advocacy here in Washington, D.C., and tried to understand the landscape of the stakeholder networks that are trying to influence government policy. And one observation that I've made that is actually very similar to what it was at the beginning of the global AIDS movement is that there are a wide number of stakeholder groups that are pursuing their own agendas in parallel, and it's scattershot.
Mm-hmm.
As an example of that, there are over 50 bills that have been introduced in the House of Representatives this year alone on the climate issue. While that is a sign of interest and momentum, and there's also a fair number of bipartisan bills that have been introduced,
Mm-hmm.
scattershot, because if we're lucky, we're going to get one or two bills passed. And this was a very similar thing that happened at the beginning of the global AIDS movement. There were many different stakeholder groups, and they were each pursuing their own agendas. And it was a bit of scattershot. And it took like a bit of whipping and jockeying to try to get civil society and external actors to align around a common agenda for action. And I think that is what needs to happen in the climate space here as well, that there's got to be some kind of process that encourages and enables a large number of these stakeholder groups to coalesce and get behind an aligned strategy.
So you're going to be hosting the first annual Climate Restoration Forum on September 17th at the United Nations in New York. And this is a breakthrough forum that will involve national leaders just prior to the General Assembly meetings. And what you're talking about, I've seen in many movements over the years. It's a lack of a center. And what I've always looked back on, it's a series of books I read in college 30, 40 years ago. By Seymour Saracen, a community psychologist who taught at Yale, and he always talked about the creation of setting. Those settings are where people can come together and have these conversations. They need mores and they need some accepted behavior so that everybody can participate in a comfortable way, more than just the rules of debate, but a sense of fellowship. Now, is that the kind of thing you think will bring global leaders together, is having a space where this conversation can begin to happen without the kinds of disinformation that we've been fighting for so long, because it's just so plain and obvious that this is real and happening?
Yeah, so I think the international community has been mobilizing itself over the last 5, 10, 20 years. Most recently, there was the agreement around the Paris Climate Accord in December of 2015 that focused on really dramatically accelerating efforts to deal with mitigation of CO2 emissions, to reduce CO2 emissions. The Paris Accord also has some provisions that focused on what we call climate adaptation, which means to adapt to the crisis as it's going to unfold. How do you deal with these storms? How do you deal with sea level rise? That's what adaptation is. So those two pillars of climate action have been brought together, and people are mobilizing around that at the city level, the county level, national governments, and at this global level. The work that I've been doing with the Foundation for Climate Restoration, and this is also a priority of Build a Movement 2020, is to bring forward a third leg of the stool, a third leg of the climate action stool. So while we continue to need to do all that work on reducing CO2 emissions and accelerating action on adaptation, what's missing from the current framework of action is the opportunity that we have to restore the climate back to the way it was in the pre-industrial era. So that means that we have to remove 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So that we can get the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere, which is now at 415 parts per million, going up to 450 parts per million probably. And we have to get that back down to under 300 parts per million through the use of massive carbon dioxide removal technologies. So this is going to be a whole new industry, a whole new focus of human society. And the good news from the Foundation for Climate Restoration's perspective is that we have available and existing technologies that if they could be brought to scale, we could actually have a huge impact and make significant progress on climate restoration. The reason why this is so important is that it's a hopeful positive future that we can create together.
Yes, yes. And I think that your notion of the third leg is also what I was saying in terms of the creationist setting, is that people don't join together unless they feel like they have an opportunity to work towards. Getting together just to commiserate is not an effective political basis for discussion. But the fact that we can make progress towards removing that, and for those of you at home, those gigatons of carbon dioxide are 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide, which is also enough to provide fuel and all sorts of materials for new science and new industries, as well as the money that will flow into pulling that out of the environment. So we've created a discussion now that is not just about the urgency, but about the opportunities that are starting to evolve out of it, as well as the return to our grandparents' environment. Something approximating 300 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, when you meet with folks in New York in a couple of weeks, we're recording this just a little earlier than that, and you're going to also be seeing folks like Greta Thunberg, who are leading climate strikes the week following that, gathering in New York. Is this a week we should be watching as citizens for an opportunity to begin to act in concert?
Absolutely. I believe that September is a breakthrough month for the global climate response. And I think everyone should be waking up and paying attention and engaging in whatever way they can. You know, even myself, I've gone through feelings of hopelessness and despair. And sometimes that puts me into a place of inaction and complacency. And I would say the opportunity that we have with climate restoration, the climate mobilization, and the climate strikes that are coming up, this is changing the political landscape, and it's giving me hope and inspiring me about what's possible. And what's at stake really is the opportunity that we have to ensure the survival of humanity and the flourishing of humanity. And I think when we were just focusing on mitigation and adaptation, we were only trying to make things not so worse. And it's not working, actually. CO2 emissions are continuing to increase. Adaptation efforts are failing to meet the challenges, as we saw with the Hurricane Dorian just this past week. And so by adding in this third leg of the stool around climate restoration, which is this ambitious goal of removing the 1,000 gigatons or the 1 trillion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, adding that on as a third leg of the stool gives us hope and possibility for a positive future. And we're excited that the youth-led movements, including with the Future Coalition and the Extinction Rebellion and the Sunrise Movement, and all these movements of young people are starting to understand that climate restoration is something that they should fight for and that they can champion, and that together we can achieve this. So I would definitely invite your listeners to listen in. On September 17th will be the first ever Global Climate Restoration Forum at the United Nations. You can go to the Foundation for Climate Restoration.org website and register to attend the summit, or you can actually sign up to watch the live webcast of the event. And then following that immediately over the course of September 20th through the 27th, there will be climate strikes everywhere in the US and all around the world. And the organizers of these strikes are expecting that this will be the largest mobilization, the largest marching, the largest striking ever in human history, because it will be happening on a global scale everywhere across the US and everywhere around the world. And so this is affecting the political landscape. We've already seen a huge uptake of interest in the climate emergency from the Democratic field. And I also see a big change on Capitol Hill, where there are more and more Green Republicans that are coming out of hiding and wanting to step forward and bringing forward their ideas for how to address the climate emergency.
It is amazing that we are starting to see that kind of disclosure of shared concern from the Republicans, and it's good. I don't want to criticize all of them for the behavior of some of them. And as you look at, particularly at these younger folks who are just undertaking this lifelong crusade that we're all going to be involved in, What advice would you give them, knowing what you know now that you didn't when you started as a doctor working to address just human injustice around the world as part of your practice, because you identified early the social element to medicine?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. One of the things that I've been discussing with some of the youth-led climate leaders is the critical importance of what I call transgenerational advocacy, where they are doing their role. They are fired up and they're on the streets and they're marching, and they have an opportunity to build out the movement to be inclusive and open to all people everywhere, and to ensure that it is a whole society movement. There were some aspects of what they were doing over the past year that were sort of exclusivity, and they were sort of like not very welcoming to adults.
Yeah.
And I think that is starting to shift now. And there's sister adult coalitions now that are forming in alignment with the youth-led coalitions. I think that is really critical. The other big lesson is that when you have this kind of political mobilization, like what's coming up with the climate strikes and the UN meetings that we talked about, you have to be really clear about what your demands are. What do you want to get from the leaders? You can't just march on the street and say, we want you to do something. We have to be more specific about what exactly we want them to do. And so Build a Movement 2020, for example, has put out an action alert that is calling for a climate restoration emergency action bill to be introduced and passed by Congress as fast as possible. So we're looking for a massive legislation that will mobilize the whole US government, mobilize the resources that are required, mobilize the research and development that's required to bring forward climate restoration solutions at scale as fast as possible. So we believe that a bill, a legislative vehicle, is something that is tangible and concrete, that could be a benefit, that could result in actual action happening in the world that could have a big impact. So the marching and the mobilization is critical, but it's also critical to link it to a particular legislative vehicle, in this case, the Climate Restoration Emergency Action Bill. And so I would invite your listeners to engage in advocacy around that idea for a bill by going to www.bam2020.world, which is the Build a Movement website. And there we have an action center where you can actually take action, sign up, and communicate directly with your local county officials, with your state officials, and your federal officials, and calling for climate restoration emergency action. That would be extremely helpful at this time.
I think that's citizens leading their legislators towards what they want. We tend to think it's the other way around, and it's not. And it's really, it is so important to get that out and to recognize it. So is there a particular senator or legislator in the U.S. House or Senate that you think people ought to be contacting and trying to support in terms of sponsorship of the Climate Action Emergency Bill?
Yes. In fact, Representative Francis Rooney, a Republican from the Tampa, Florida area, is a Republican. He is the co-chair of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. He has introduced and is supporting several very important climate fee and dividend and climate tax bills. And his staff are actively working on a Global Climate Restoration Act. And so I think reaching out to Francis Rooney's office and encouraging him to lead and encouraging him to bring forward bold and transformational climate restoration emergency action legislation is a critical opportunity. So he would be my number one focus.
Fantastic. That's great advice, and I will be doing that as well. So, Paul, thank you very much. This is Dr. Paul Zeitz, who we've been speaking to. He is the founder of Build a Movement 2020, a physician who has worked on the global climate crisis, or excuse me, that too, global AIDS crisis, and has been involved in sustainable development research with the Department of State. Paul, thanks very much for joining us on Sustainability in Your Ear today.
Great. Thanks, Mitch. Have a great day.
And we'll encourage everybody to tune in and watch the first annual Climate Restoration Forum. There'll be a link in the posting, folks, if you'd like to sign up. Thanks, everybody, for taking a few moments with Earth 911 today. We'll be back with you soon.